Raketerm facade panels. The Raketerm facade solution is based on reinforced composite panels consisting of two parts, a covering layer, a thermal insulation layer. The covering layer gives the panel its fire and weather-resistant properties and mechanical strength. Under the covering layer, unique plastic dowels are integrated to increase central stability. The insulation layer of the panel consists of polyurethane foam with glass fibre mesh reinforcement on the back-facing side. The expanded polystyrene is used as a filler for the thermal insulation layer to minimise weight and increase stability of the panel. The tongue and groove joints between the panels ensure the cladding is water and wind resistant. The dimensions of the Raketerm panels depend on the size of the brick slips used. Because of this, panel length can vary between 1,125 and 1,313 millimetres. The panel height between 545 and 609 millimetres, and the panel thickness between 46 and 58 millimetres. Upon installation, 1 to 2 millimetres should always be added to the panel length, since panel joints are unlikely to be completely precise as the products themselves have minimal dimensional tolerances. Clinker brick slip and joint mortar is supplied together with the facade panels. For cladding of building corners, large corner pieces are to be used. The jambs and heads of openings are covered with smaller corner pieces. The jambs can also be covered with metal flashing. The corner pieces are available both as right-handed and left-handed configurations. They are installed alternately on top of each other and attached to frame elements, which have been assembled according to the instructions. Please note that Raketerm panels are rigid. They cannot be bent, twisted or compressed. The following tools and equipment are required for the installation: an impact drill, an angle grinder with a stone cutting disc and preferably a dust extractor, a cordless screwdriver, a levelling instrument, a silicone gun, a mortar mixer, various other hand tools and personal protective equipment, as well as clamps, screws, wall plugs and washers. The facade panels can be installed on both metal and wooden frames, which may be both horizontal and vertical. In the design stage of a framed building, the spacing of frame elements can be adapted for specific panel installations. For a wooden frame assembly, use structural timbers with a minimal cross-section of 22 by 45 millimeters, which is pre-impregnated with wood preservatives. For the assembly of the metal base frame sections, use hot-dip galvanized steel top hat sections with a minimum thickness of at least 1 millimeter and with a minimum hat height of 15 millimeters, or corresponding aluminium sections. Vertical base frame assembly. Start the base frame assembly at the outer corners of the building. Mount either the timber or metal frame elements vertically to the corners of the building, as close to each other as possible. In the same manner, install the frame corner elements to all outer corners of the building. The vertical frame elements at the inner building corners should be installed as close as possible to each other without touching each other to avoid direct contact. In order to install the next frame element, measure the length of the inner side of the shorter arm of the corner piece. Install the frame element vertically so that the distance between the imaginary top of the intersection of the planes of the frame elements of two adjacent walls and the centre line of the frame element is equal to the length of the corner piece's shorter arm. Install a vertical frame element to the same distance from the top of the imaginary angle onto the adjacent wall as well. Also, install the vertical frame elements to the opening's edges. Measure the length of the panel. Install the next frame elements to the distance equal to half of the panel length, centre line to centre line. Check that the corner piece fits correctly onto the frame elements. If required, adjust the frame element's position. Fasten the vertical frame elements to all walls at the same spacing. Now you have completed the vertical base frame for facade panels. Vertical base frame assembly on a lattice. For vertical base frames, first assemble a base made of horizontal sections on the lattice. Install the horizontal frame elements onto the lattice frame, covered with the wind barrier at an approximate spacing of 600 mm. Also install the horizontal frame elements above and below any openings. Check the vertical alignment and the horizontal level of the base frame. If necessary, use wedges to achieve the desired outcome. Start the vertical base frame assembly at the outer corners of the building. Mount the timber or metal frame elements vertically to the corners of the building, as close to the top as possible. In the same manner, install the frame corner elements to all outer corners of the building. At the inner building corners, install the frame elements vertically as close to each other as possible, but not in direct abutment. In order to install the next frame element, measure the length of the inner side of the shorter arm of the corner piece. Install the frame element vertically so that the distance between the intersection of the planes of the frame elements of two adjacent walls form an angle. In other words, the top of the imaginary angle to the center line of the frame element is equal to the length of the shorter arm of the angle. Install a vertical frame element to the same distance from the top of the angle onto the adjacent wall as well. Install the vertical frame elements to the edges of the openings. Measure the length of the panel. Install the next frame elements to the distance equal to half of the panel length, center line to center line. Check that the corner piece fits correctly onto the frame elements. If required, adjust the frame element's position. Fasten the vertical frame elements to all walls at the same spacing. Now you have completed the vertical base frame on the lattice. Horizontal base frame assembly. Install the perforated frame elements horizontally above the building's plinth level. In addition, install the perforated frame elements above and below any openings. Measure the height of the panel. Install the next horizontal frame element with a spacing equal to the panel height as measured from the lower edge of the bottom frame element to the lower edge of the next frame element. Check that the upper edge of the panel is supported on the frame element over at least a few millimeters. If required, adjust the frame element's position. Fasten the horizontal frame elements to all the walls at the spacing equal to the panel height. In order to install the vertical battens for the central panel fixtures, measure the length of the inner side of the corner piece's shorter arm, as well as the length of the panel. Install the frame element vertically so that the distance between the imaginary top of the intersection of the planes of the frame element of two adjacent walls and the center line of the frame element is equal to the length of the corner piece's shorter arm plus half of the panel length. Install the first vertical batten of the next panel row to the distance equal to the corner piece's shorter arm from the imaginary top of the angle. Install the vertical batten of the first panel row onto the adjacent wall to the distance equal to the length of the shorter arm of the corner piece from the top of the angle. Install the vertical batten of the next panel row to the distance equal to the length of the corner piece's shorter arm plus half of the panel length. Check that the corner piece fits correctly onto the frame elements. If required, adjust the frame element's position. Install the next vertical battens to the distance equal to the panel length, center line to center line. Install the vertical battens to all walls at the spacing equal to the panel length with a 2-panel row recurrence. Now you have completed the horizontal base frame for facade panels. Mounting facade panels onto the frame. Mark the height of the bottom edge of the first panel row by drawing a line on the corner element of the frame. Measure and draw another line 50 mm above the first one. This gives you the height mark of the upper edge of the backside of the reference strip. Mark this height horizontally on all frame sections using either a leveling instrument or a marking cord and a spirit level. The reference strip must be made of galvanized sheet steel at least 1 mm thick, or use a corresponding special aluminium section. It is recommended to perforate the rib of the reference strip by drilling holes 5 mm in diameter at intervals of about 20 centimeters. Place the upper edge of the reference strip against the height mark and fasten it horizontally to the frame. Fix clamps to the reference strip centered on each frame element. In the case of wooden framed buildings, fix the clamps to the first panel row and every panel row after the movement joint rigidly by 2 screws. Place the screws of the clamps of subsequent panel rows to the bottom edge of the slotted hole. This allows movement of the panel cladding due to any possible shrinkage of the wooden frame and the transfer of possible deformations to the movement joint. In case of multi-story buildings with wooden frames, the horizontal joint between any 2 floors must be a movement joint. Correct mounting of the entire first panel row is at least as important as the mounting of the first corner. Therefore, proceed with care. The first panel row must be installed precisely horizontally and in line with the reference strip. Start mounting the facade panels from the left corner of the wall. Place a large left-hand or right-hand corner piece above the reference strip. Press the piece down firmly until the groove at its bottom in the thermal insulation layer fully rests on the hidden clamps below it. Make sure that both arms of the corner piece have their panel ends extending exactly to the center lines of the frame sections. Apply a thin layer of silicone on the outer edge of the reference strip. Following that, install the corner piece. Check its vertical alignment on both sides. And fix the piece to the frame with hidden clamps on the upper part of the tongue. In order to seal the vertical joints of the panels, apply a thin layer of silicone to the external edge of the joint tongue on the side of the previous panel. Following that, press the next panel firmly in place so that the joint tongue of the previous panel slides into the groove of the next panel. The panel stands as tight as possible against the previous one. The groove at the bottom of the thermal insulation layer fully rests on the hidden clamps. Check the horizontal alignment and height of the panel and install the central upper hidden clamp. Fasten the panel by driving a screw through it at one of the fixture points in the center. Before this, drill an approximately 15 mm hole in the joint mortar for the screw head. Check the level of the panel and install the upper left hidden clamp and the other central fixing screw. Mount the next panels in the same manner, checking the horizontal and vertical alignment of each panel. Mounting of the reference strip and corner pieces, jambs and the first panel rows constitute the most important stages of the installation. Special care in these stages prevents problems in subsequent stages. If you are carrying out a panel installation for the first time, it is recommended to commence installation from the least visible part of the building. In order to seal horizontal joints of panels, apply a thin layer of silicone along the external edge of the joint tongue on the upper side of the panel below. Start with mounting a corner piece, but this time in an opposite configuration as compared to the panel row below, followed by panels and claddings of jambs, heads and other corners. To prevent conjunction of the 4 corners of thermal insulation boards, panels are mounted in the staggered pattern, each panel row shifted against the previous panel row by half a panel's length. Place the screws to the bottom edge of the oval holes of hidden clamps up to the horizontal movement joint. You have now finished the mounting of the facade panels. What remains is to glue the brick slips to their sockets and to carry out the pointing of the brick slips and the panels. Mounting facade panels on a supporting wall. Before mounting the facade panel, check the horizontal and vertical alignment of all walls. Mark the height of the bottom edge of the first panel row onto one of the building's corners. Measure and draw another line 50 mm above the first one. This gives you the height mark of the upper edge of the backside of the reference strip. Using either a leveling instrument or a marking cord and a spirit level, mark this height on all outer and inner corners of the building and draw straight lines connecting these height marks on the walls. The reference strip must be made of galvanized sheet steel, at least 1 mm thick, or use a corresponding special aluminium section. If you install additional thermal insulation, the reference strip must be 40 mm wider than the thickness of the additional thermal insulation layer. It is recommended to perforate the rib of the reference strip by drilling holes 5 mm in diameter at intervals of about 20 cm. Place the upper edge of the reference strip against the marking line and fasten it horizontally around the building perimeter. Choose the fasteners according to the base structure. If improvement of the thermal insulation of the exterior structure is required or preferred, a rigid thermal insulation board of preferred thickness suitable for facade works may be installed under the facade panels. There is no need for the extensive gluing of the additional thermal insulation boards onto the supporting wall. 2 or 3 fastening dowels per square metre do the job, since the board will subsequently be pressed between the supporting wall and the facade panels. Carefully fill or hermetically seal the joints between additional thermal insulation boards. The facade panels must be installed on their base in an airtight manner. Start the facade panel installation from the left corner of the wall, 1 panel row at a time. Correct mounting of the entire first panel row is at least as important as the mounting of the first corner. Therefore, proceed with care. The first panel must be installed precisely horizontally and in line with the reference strip. Place a large left-hand or right-hand corner piece above the reference strip. Check the vertical alignment of the piece at both sides and fasten it with screws in the designated places using a stainless or galvanized washer of at least 28 mm in diameter under the screw head. Make sure the screw head does not protrude from the surface of the panel's thermal insulation layer, otherwise the level gluing of the clinker brick slips will be impossible. In order to seal the vertical joints of panels, apply a thin layer of silicone on the external edge of the joint tongue on the side of the previous panel. Following that, press the next panel firmly in place so that the joint tongue of the previous panel slides into the groove of the next panel, and the panel stands as tightly as possible against the previous one. Check the horizontal alignment and height of the panel and fasten it with a screw at the upper left fixture point. Check once more whether the panel is perfectly aligned and install the next 3 screws with washers to the panel's edges. Finish attaching the panel to the wall by driving 2 screws through the panel's centre into the holes between the second and third brick slips at the top and the bottom of the panel. Before this, drill a 15 mm hole in the joint mortar for the screw head. Apply the through fixing screws at the centre. Mount the next panels in the same manner, checking the horizontal and vertical alignment of each panel. In order to seal horizontal joints of panels, apply a thin layer of silicone along the external edge of the joint tongue on the upper side of the panel below. Start with mounting a corner piece, but this time in the opposite configuration as compared to the panel row below, followed by panels and claddings of jambs, heads and other corners. To prevent conjunction of the 4 corners of the thermal insulation boards, panels are mounted in a staggered pattern, each panel row shifted against the previous panel row by half a panel's length. You have now finished mounting facade panels onto a supporting wall. What remains is to glue the brick slips into their sockets and to carry out the pointing of the glued brick slips and to point the horizontal panel joints. Making inner corners. To make an inner corner, cut a panel to the required length, mount it in its place, and fasten it. When cutting panels, follow the applicable health and safety rules. Cut the adjacent panel to size. When mounting the adjacent panel, leave a 10 mm vertical gap between the 2 panels. When the corner panels have been fastened along the entire height of the corner, fill the gap with building foam. Press the joint string on the gap and seal it with joint mastic. Gluing brick slips. To maintain the brick pattern, the brick slips must overlap the panel junctions for every other panel. Since this cannot be arranged at the factory, the brick slips must be glued in place during the installation. Use neutral silicone or assembly adhesive to glue the brick slips to their respective sockets. The glue must be intended for the temperature range of -40 to +100 degrees Celsius. Check that the surfaces of the brick slips to be glued and the surfaces of the brick slip plates are level and aligned in height. Finishing of joints. The last stage of facade panel installation is the finishing of joints, which is carried out after the brick slip glue has set. For the best pointing results, the air temperature must not be lower than +10 degrees Celsius and the relative humidity must not exceed 70%. To fill the spaces around the glued brick slips and to point the panel joints and screw holes, use only joint mortar, prepared by mixing the dry compound that came with the product with water. Follow the instructions of the dry compound manufacturer. The accuracy of the dry compound to water ratio is of utmost importance from the viewpoint of pointing quality. Prepare the joint mortar as a dry pack. When smoothing joints with a pointing tool, do not allow a water membrane to form on the surface, otherwise the tone of the point may change noticeably. Where required, let the mortar harden after filling the joints and before smoothing them with the pointing tool. The mortar is pressed into the joints and smoothed with the pointing tool. This way, clean pointing and an invisible junction are achieved. The pointing mortar should not be too wet. Adding water to the mortar mix after it has started to set is not advised. Try to avoid staining the brick slips during pointing, otherwise they must be cleaned later. If the tone of the refilled joints differs from that of the factory-made joints, the colour can be trimmed by treating the joints with tinted latex. Use weatherproof mastic to seal all spaces around panels and openings, penetrations and other joints. When the joints have completely dried, in the summer it takes approximately 4 weeks, the finished surface may be washed and treated with clinker oil or an impregnating solution if desired. Sheet metal jambs, heads and sills. Measure, mark and cut panels for the edges of any openings before the installation. When cutting, follow applicable work safety requirements. When finishing jambs or heads using flashings or sections prior to panel installation, cut an approximately 10 mm deep groove between the brick slip plate and the thermal insulation layer, into which the edge of the flashing will be pressed later on. Install the window sills. When cladding jambs and heads, use special sheet metal sections that cover the cut surfaces of the facade panel brick slips and lock into the groove between the brick slip layer and the thermal insulation layer to ensure the cladding jambs and heads are waterproof. Install the flashings. Temporary removal of single brick slips. If the distance between the panel edge or centre fixtures and the cut surface of the panel around openings at the building's corners exceed 1/4 of the panel's length, additional screw fastening is required. For this, a middle partial brick slip is to be removed from the panel's edge. First, cut open the mortar pointing around the brick slip to be removed and carefully detach the slip from the panel. Following that, drive in a screw with a washer. Make sure the screw head does not protrude from the surface of the panel's thermal insulation layer, otherwise the level gluing of the clinker brick slips will be impossible. Clean the removed brick slip of excessive mortar, glue it back into its place, and use joint mortar around it. If required, do the same above and below any openings. Remove a brick slip at the necessary location. Drive in a screw with a washer. Glue the brick slip to its place and use joint mortar around it. The same goes for the installation of scaffold fasteners. Remove a brick slip at the necessary location and install scaffold fasteners through the panel's insulation layer. When dismantling the scaffolding, remove the fastener. Fill the remaining hole with building foam. Glue the brick slip back into place and use joint mortar around it. Use of swivel clamps. Use the swivel clamps for attachment of cut panels around openings. For this, cut a recess of the required size into the panel's thermal insulation layer at the required location. Press the clamp into the recess and fasten it to the frame. Most common mistakes made during installation works. Do not store the panels at the worksite with the brick slip side facing up. Rainwater accumulating in the joints may wash out cement salts and change the tone of the joints. Do not apply silicone into the tongue groove of the panel, since this will prevent the proper seal of the panels. Nails, screws or similar items should not be used for brick slip support during the hardening of the glue. The aids used for support may not be inserted into the thermal insulation layer, otherwise the facade cladding may not remain watertight. Adding water to the mortar mix after it has started to set is absolutely advised against. Try to avoid staining the brick slips when pointing, otherwise they must be cleaned later. The result of correctly performed facade work is indistinguishable from clean joint masonry.